It did not arrive with a trumpet. It made no noise when it entered. There was no rider, no scroll, no royal seal. And yet, in palace after palace, from Florence to Lisbon, from Vienna to Isfahan, something slipped silently through the shadows and past the guards, past the gates, past even the most well-guarded bedchambers. And when it touched a crown, it left not a mark, but a whisper, one that spread not through war, but through blood, through skin, through lips, through trust. This is not the story of a battlefield. It is not the story of a revolution. This is the story of a disease that was too intimate to be spoken of in open court, too shameful to be written in the royal diaries, too slow to be seen as a threat, until it had already begun its quiet destruction. And for centuries, it had no name that kings dared speak, only a face that was never painted, and a legacy that outlived even the longest dynasties. In those days, the royal courts of Europe were temples of illusion. There were diamonds that sparkled on the necks of queens, velvet drapes soaked in candlelight, and musicians who played melodies to drown out sorrow. Behind every coronation, every feast, every diplomatic union, there was always a hush, the silence of things not spoken, the silence of heirs not born, of queens who bled quietly in their chambers, of princes who trembled behind drawn curtains. And within that silence, a ghost moved, not a ghost of the past, but of the present, a phantom not wrapped in death, but in desire. They called it many things: the French disease, the great pox, the secret curse. But it had one true name, and that name was Syphilis. And unlike the enemies kings had faced for centuries, it wore no armor, and yet it could not be slain. It rode not on horseback, but on breath. It crossed not rivers, but bedsheets. It began, as all phantoms do, without anyone noticing. In the late 15th century, the first outbreak swept through Naples, and then across the continent with terrifying speed. It was a time of war, of movement, of shifting borders, and hungry ambition. The disease hit mercenaries first, then merchants, then kings. Soldiers returning from battle brought back not only wounds and coin, but something that would infect not just their bodies, but their futures. There were reports of pustules, of madness, of noses falling away. At first, it was seen as divine punishment. Then it was feared as poison. But in the courts, it was something far more dangerous. It was an embarrassment. And because embarrassment was more dangerous than war, the powerful learned quickly how to hide it. The strange thing was how familiar the pattern became. A prince, radiant in youth, full of promise, would begin to wither before 30. A queen, once celebrated for her fertility, would miscarry again and again, her hopes for an heir dissolving with each silent month. Courtiers would whisper of mood swings, of erratic behavior, of fevers of the mind, but no one said the word aloud. The disease did not need to march, it only needed to be ignored. And so it spread, through banquets and treaties, through affairs and marriages, through the hearts of rulers who were never trained to be careful, only to be powerful. There was no cure. Not yet. Mercury was tried. Of course it always was. Bleeding, purging, tinctures of exotic powders from the east. But nothing stopped it. It could be quiet for years. Even decades. It could let a king believe he was healed, only to return and strip away his memory, his balance, his reason. There were those who lost their faces to it, who wore masks to court, not out of vanity, but necessity. There were those who infected their wives, who in turn could bear no sons, who in turn left empires to fall to cousins and war. And because the disease was secret, no one ever blamed it. They blamed ambition. They blamed fate. They blamed women. They blamed God. But the disease remained, unmoved by blame, and behind the velvet curtains of courts that still sang with music, it waited. It was in these palaces that history began to bend. In Florence, a young father died within days of his wife, leaving behind a daughter who would grow up in silence and later rule France with a heart carved by abandonment. In Persia, a Shah, once known for golden goblets and midnight poetry, vanished from his own court before reaching 40. In London, a poet earl who once made kings laugh died, blind and disfigured, his nose eaten away. His last days lived in shame. In Vienna, sons died before fathers. Queens wept alone in corridors where the sound of children never came. And empires crumbled from the inside out, not from revolution, not from invasion, but from something far smaller, far softer, far more human. This disease did not respect rank. It did not care for lineage. It spared neither empress nor general. And still, it was never mentioned. Official portraits were painted without blemish. Medical notes were lost or sealed. Royal journals omitted the pain. What survived was the illusion that kings were untouchable, that queens were divine, that empires fell only when cannon fire touched stone. But the truth was quieter. It was found in forgotten hospital wings, in the loneliness of banished sons, in the hidden corners of convents where barren princesses were sent to vanish. The truth was that syphilis was not a footnote. It was a co-author of history. And that is why, in this tale, we begin not with the rise of a monarch, but with a shadow, for the story of the disease is not only about the bodies it took, but the timelines it shattered, the children never born, the treaties never signed, the wars that followed, when a throne was left empty. There is no monument to it, no museum, but its fingerprints are everywhere, on the sashes of childless queens, in the eyes of widowed emperors, in the bloodlines that broke apart like porcelain under pressure. As you drift toward sleep tonight, let your breath soften, and your thoughts slow. Let the candles burn low in your imagination, and picture a hallway, long and golden, somewhere in an ancient court. At the end of it, a door. Behind it, a ruler, young, brave, full of plans, and behind that ruler, in the next room, something unseen, something waiting, something already inside. Tomorrow, we will open the first of those doors. You will meet a child left alone at birth, orphaned, not by war, but by illness. Her name was Catherine. She would become Queen of France. But long before the crown, there was a cradle and a ghost. There are children born into power, and then there are children born into its ruins. And Catherine de Medici was the latter, delivered not into the arms of a mother, but into a world already unraveling, into a house haunted not by ghosts, but by absences, where no lullabies were sung and no inheritance felt secure, only a silence thick with consequence, the kind of silence that follows not war, but sickness. Her name was given before her future was written, but that future would not be shaped by her will alone. It had already been shaped by something older, quieter, and far more patient than ambition, an infection that passed through touch, through trust, through bloodlines not yet fully formed. Lorenzo de Medici, Duke of Urbino, had been many things before he became a father, nephew of a pope, soldier of fortune, ruler, by design rather than affection, and he was For a brief moment, the embodiment of Renaissance ascendancy, polished, educated, politically placed, and young enough to believe he could outrun whatever waited in the dark corners of history. But like many men of his station and time, he lived quickly and desired broadly. And somewhere in those victories in the tented nights of military campaigns, or the velvet folds of the court's lesser shadows, he encountered what no crown could command and no prayer could reverse. His bride, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, came from French nobility, delicate by nature, but useful by alliance. And her marriage to Lorenzo had been arranged to bind Florence more tightly to France. A union of names more than souls, yet not without the possibility of tenderness. But whatever love could have bloomed was cut short, as was her life. Within 2 weeks of giving birth to their daughter, in a bed, still warm from hope and already cooling with decay. When Lorenzo died just days after her, the official words were vague fever, exhaustion, the fatigue of war. But the unofficial word, passed between midwives and diplomats alike, was Kieter, and more damning the French disease, the same whisper that had already crossed borders faster than armies, the same whisper that would one day be called Syphilis. Catherine, then, was born into loss. Not in metaphor, but in fact. Her inheritance measured not in land or loyalty, but in absence of parents, absence of certainty, absence of the protections normally afforded to one with such blood in her veins. And as politics shifted in Florence and papal favour turned elsewhere, the child became an afterthought, a Medici in name, but not yet in usefulness, shuffled into a convent, tucked behind stone and scripture, raised among nuns who had not chosen her, but accepted her all the same, as one might accept a winter guest, a presence that disrupts, then fades into the rhythm of the cloister. Years passed like pages unstirred by wind. Catherine grew, quietly. Her education was not neglected, but nor was it celebrated. She read, she observed, she waited, not because she was planning, but because there was nothing else to do, and in this waiting, a kind of resolve began to grow, not of vengeance or glory, but of something colder adaptation. When the time came, and it always does in the mechanics of dynastic need, she was called back, not by Florence, but by France. She was 12, or perhaps 13. The records vary, but the outcome is clear. She was summoned not for her charm, nor for her beauty, but because her name had regained currency. The Valois line needed reinforcement, and Catherine was, quite simply, available. Her marriage to Henry, the second son of King François I, was not romantic, nor especially strategic beyond its appearance. It was a placeholder, a union meant to plug a gap in diplomacy. But when the Dauphin died of illness, and Henri became heir, the placeholder became permanent, and Catherine, child of a forgotten room in Florence, became Dauphine, then Queen of France. Her ascent was not celebrated. Her Italian blood was viewed with suspicion, her plainness with disappointment, her lack of royal lineage with contempt. And yet, she endured not by triumph, but by durability. Her role became one of necessity, and necessity, as it often does, proved more powerful than favour. She bore 10 children, 3 of whom would become kings, all of whom would rule under the shadow of bloodshed and fragility. The Valois line, already brittle, became thinner with each passing reign, and Catherine's legacy, often painted in harsh tones, began to take shape: regent, manipulator, Patroness of art, alleged poisoner, rumoured witch, all labels applied by those who neither knew her nor cared to understand the quiet machinery that keeps a crumbling house standing. But before the accusations, before the tapestries and bloodshed, before the chambers of court were filled with the sound of conspiracies and the scent of funeral incense, there was the girl in the convent, and the bloodline touched by disease. The infection that had taken her parents had not stopped with them, it had simply moved forward, into the wombs of queens, into the genes of kings, into the future of a continent that would burn not just from war, but from inheritance. Because that is what syphilis did. More than disfigure the face, it disfigured history. It interrupted the natural order. It rearranged succession, silenced potential, and tilted the balance of power in ways no battle ever could. And for Catherine, the shadow remained not in her own body, perhaps, but in the world she was forced to navigate, one where infertility was not a personal tragedy, but a national threat, and where health was not private, but political. When she died in the year 1589, she left behind not a France at peace, but one fractured by wars of religion and succession, a kingdom gasping under the weight of its own indecision, its own inherited violence, its own forgotten infections. Catherine had ruled through 5 reigns, survived assassination attempts, navigated shifting alliances, and outlived many of her enemies. But she had never escaped the echo of that first silence, the death of her parents, the disease that killed them, and the way no one dared name it aloud. So sleep. Now, with the understanding that history does not move in lines, but in spirals, that sometimes a child born of death grows into a queen surrounded by it, and that what we call fate is often only the long shadow of a moment no one saw coming. Tomorrow, we leave Europe behind and turn eastward, to the glittering court of Persia, where wine flowed in goblets of ruby and poets sang beneath stars, and where a young Shah named Abbas would come to rule a golden empire until the disease without a name found him too. And so, as the bells of France rang low for a queen who had once been forgotten, then feared, then simply endured, another story waited beneath distant stars, one where no convent cloistered the child, no marble palace mourned a mother, but where gold flowed freely and songs rose nightly. And yet, even there, the silence would find its way in. For though Catherine's kingdom fell to blood and bitterness, another empire once shimmered with prosperity, and within it ruled a boy who was called Shah, whose hands touched silk scrolls, and whose footsteps stirred gardens of jasmine and philosophy, and whose mind would one day dim, not from politics nor betrayal, but from an affliction no poet could ever quite name. In Persia, as in Florence, the same phantom moved slow, relentless, and unseen. His name was Abbas. Born in the year 1537, he would become Shah Abbas, the second, ruler of Safavid Persia, and heir to a legacy drenched in gold and guarded by walls carved with verses older than memory. He became Shah at just 9 years old, too young to understand the weight of sovereignty, too young to sense the quiet war between appearance and reality that every ruler would one day face. And yet, he learned quickly. The court that raised him was no place for children. It was a palace of expectation, of protocol, of performance. His early years were spent not in the laughter of youth, but in the mimicry of kingship, dressed in silk robes too long for his arms, surrounded by viziers who bent low, not out of respect but calculation. By the time he turned 15, Abbas was no longer a boy playing king. He was ruler in full measure. His court dazzled with splendor, Poets penned verses in his name. Trade routes pulsed with wealth. Embassies arrived, bearing gifts, goblets encrusted with rubies. Spices, sweet and sharp. Artifacts from lands that whispered his greatness in 100 foreign tongues. He was known for his wit, his tolerance, his refinement. He hosted feasts that lasted through the night and commissioned architecture that still catches the light of the sun centuries later. His Persia gleamed like a polished mirror, reflecting power, progress, and peace. Or so it seemed, because beneath all mirrors, there is always something they do not reflect. And behind Abbas's rise, there was something else. Something that could not be softened by poetry or delayed by pageantry. In the quiet chambers behind the music, where no courtier was invited and no scribes were present, Abbas was beginning to fade. Not in body, not at first, but in spirit, and then, slowly, in both. The first signs were subtle, a weariness that could not be explained by labor, a withdrawal from the very pleasures he had once defined. The great feasts grew shorter, the audiences less frequent. The man who had once embraced conversation now preferred solitude. Some said it was grief. Others said religion, but those closest to him, those who had seen the tremors in his fingers, the lost glint in his eyes, knew better. Syphilis had found him. How it arrived? No one can say. Like all diseases of intimacy, it needed no army. No envoy, no decree. It moved between silk sheets and passing sighs, between an embrace and a goodbye. And by the time the first fever arrived, it had already woven itself into the body of empire. Abbas, like so many sovereigns before him, had lived well and freely. His court, renowned for its tolerance and indulgence, was not immune to the appetites that had defined rulers for generations. He had trusted his health to his rank, and now his rank could no longer protect him. The disease worked patiently. That is its nature. It does not strike all at once. It arrives, then waits, and so Abbas declined, not with a fall, but with a slow descent. It grew quiet. His letters became erratic. His commands, infrequent. The architects who once received commissions for great mosques received silence. The poets who waited for patronage found their verses unanswered. The music that had once echoed through Isfahan's courtyards drifted into hush. The golden court, so full of brilliance, began to dim. By the time he reached 34, Abbas was no longer seen in public. The official records said little. Illness. Yes. Exhaustion. Perhaps. But the truth, as always, remained behind veils. Those who tended to him whispered of hallucinations, of terrible pain, of nights filled with screams, too human to be denied, and too shameful to be acknowledged. His mind, once so sharp, had begun to fragment. The disease, in its later stages, does not only harm the body, it consumes the self. It confuses, contorts, collapses, and in the case of a king, it dismantles a legacy from within. He died that same year. No grand battle marked his passing. No foreign army breached his walls. It was not a betrayal that ended his reign, nor a rebellion. It was something much older, much quieter, a whisper that had entered centuries ago and had simply waited its turn. And with Abbas's death came something greater than the loss of a ruler. It marked the beginning of the end for Persia's golden age. The court, already uncertain, grew unstable. Trade waned. Culture slowed. Successors followed. But none could recapture the radiance that Abbas had once carried so effortlessly. His illness had stolen more than a man. It had taken momentum, interrupted confidence, broken continuity. The Safavid dynasty would continue. Yes, but the shadow had been cast, and its length would only grow. And once again, the question echoed the same question that followed Catherine's reign, that haunted the Medici cradle, that hovered above the French court. What might history have looked like had the disease not arrived? Had Abbas lived longer? Had his mind remained whole? Had his voice continued to guide Persia into the modern world, rather than retreat from it in silence? It is a question we will ask again and again, for Abbas was not the last. There were others. In London, a poet hero who laughed his way through pain until it swallowed him whole. In Vienna, an emperor whose legacy was undone by what he passed unknowingly to his wife. In Lisbon, a king who once translated Shakespeare, only to be silenced by the thing he could not read in his own body. But tonight, let us leave Abbas where he rests, not in shame, but in remembrance. Let us see him not as a victim, but as a reflection of something deeper, how even the most brilliant light can be dimmed by something no crown can stop, how empires fall not with war, but with quiet disappearance. Tomorrow, we cross the sea to England, where laughter once lit the court of Charles II, and where a man named Rochester burned too brightly, too fast, before the same phantom that took Shah Abbas finally claimed his voice, his vision, and his name. It was the kind of era where men drank wine as if memory could be drowned, where kings wore lace and perfume to cover the rot of politics, and where the most dangerous words were not shouted in rebellion, but whispered in rhyme. England, newly awake from its Puritan slumber, had crowned its exiled king and opened its doors to pleasure. And in that swirl of satin and satire, in the flicker of candles and the echo of chamber music, there came a man who did not ask for permission. John Wilmot, the second Earl of Rochester, the kind of man who arrived in a room like a dare. He was not born to be a legend, but he made himself one not through war or invention, but through audacity. A poet sharper than steel, a wit quicker than guillotine, and a libertine whose name stirred both laughter and warning. He moved through London like smoke with a smile, always just one step ahead of consequence. He knew the court, not as a servant of it, but as its favourite distraction. Charles II adored him, not despite his recklessness, but because of it, for in Rochester's scandals, the king saw a freedom he himself could never fully enjoy. There was nothing sacred to him not love, not God, not even himself. He mocked everyone, especially the powerful, and never apologized for the fire he lit under their vanity. In another century, he would have been burned for such words. In this one, he was applauded. But while others clapped, something else was clapping back slower, deeper, from inside his own bones. For the body does not care for poetry. The body does not listen to applause. And while Rochester moved from one bed to another, from one tavern to another, from stage to satire to seduction and back again, the disease that had travelled from Naples to Paris, from Florence to Persia, had also found its way to Restoration London. Syphilis did not knock. It did not ask. It arrived, invisible, and it stayed. At first, it was easy to mistake the signs for the aftermath of indulgence, headaches, tremors, fevers, blurred thoughts. Nothing unfamiliar to a man who rarely saw the sunrise sober. He laughed it off, laughed everything off. But syphilis is slow and cruel. It allows its victims to joke for a while before it begins to remove their punchlines. His skin began to change. His face began to thin. The sharpness of his gaze dulled, and the words, those brilliant, cutting words, came slower, with less certainty. His hands, once theatrical in motion, trembled. He no longer mocked the court, he merely sat in it. As if forgetting why he came, the world began to look through him, rather than at him. And then came the shame, not moral, for he had never believed in that, but physical. His face, once considered handsome in the way dangerous men sometimes are, began to decay. His nose collapsed. His sight faded. He no longer flirted. He flinched. The man who had seduced with confidence now avoided mirrors, and the rooms that once held his laughter now echoed only with music he could no longer hear. He left London, or rather, it left him. He retreated to the countryside, to the care of those who remembered him as more than what he had become. It was there, in a theatre house, without theatre or applause, that the fire he had outrun finally caught him. He did not die laughing. He died remembering. There were days near the end when he spoke without poetry, when he asked for forgiveness not with performance, but with sincerity. He did not rewrite his legacy, but he softened it. There is a kind of wisdom that comes not from philosophy, but from suffering. And in his final verses, written by a man no longer beautiful, no longer feared, no longer on stage, there are traces of that wisdom, painful, human, and utterly real. He was 33. And when he died, London barely paused. The court continued. Charles still danced. The taverns filled with new voices, but something had shifted. The silence Rochester left behind was not empty. It was instructive. For if a man that clever, that celebrated, to that alive could vanish, like that, what else might be waiting beneath the satin of other men's coats? What else was crawling behind the perfumes and poetry? His death, though small in politics, was massive in symbolism. It was the price of forgetting that flesh fails, that laughter ends, that even the most brilliant voices must someday speak through blood and bone. Not long after Rochester fell, another man, far away from England's theatres and verses, would stand beside his wife and look upon a future that should have belonged to a son. He would not be a poet. He would be an emperor. And unlike Rochester, he would not burn fast but decay slowly, taking with him not only a throne, but an entire dynasty's ability to continue, not in shame, not in violence, but in silence. It begins, as many imperial tragedy do, not with fire, but with warmth. A young man ascends a throne, not yet heavy with loss. His shoulders are straight. His uniform is crisp. His mother weeps. But his people cheer. He is Joseph I, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And for a time, it seems the Habsburgs have been reborn in his smile. He is everything his lineage had long needed: tall, graceful, eloquent without stiffness, charming without excess, and clever in the way that unnerved older men in gilded rooms. Vienna, still wrapped in the cold silk of centuries-old rituals, breathes easier in his presence. The old world thinks it has found its modern prince. He marries Wilhelmina Amalia of Brunswick-Lüneburg, a woman whose name takes longer to speak than it took him to admire her. Their wedding is neither epic nor tragic. It is arranged, expected, proper, but not without tenderness. He does not touch her with fire. He touches her with duty. And she, raised for this purpose, does not tremble. They do not fall in love. They lean toward it, carefully, but something follows them. It has no face, no title. It is not an enemy in court or a cousin with a claim. It is smaller, older, and already inside him. Joseph is not innocent, nor is he cruel. He is simply like most young emperors. Convinced of his invincibility, he is drawn to beauty, to adventure, to pleasure that does not bear consequence until it does. Somewhere in his youth, in a bed not remembered by history, he is infected with a disease that would rewrite not his name. But his bloodline, he does not know at first. Or he does and ignores it. That is the easier path. But Syphilis, as it has proven again and again, does not rest quietly. It creeps not only through the veins, but into the family tree. One day, Wilhelmina Amalia is no longer able to bear children. There is no drama to it, no bleeding on the marble, no death in labor, just a closing, quiet and complete. The physicians do not explain, or they do, but with phrases that float like fog complications. Inflammation, unexplained scarring. Behind closed doors, someone mutters the word. It does not reach the Empress's ears, but it reaches the throne. There will be no son, no heir, only daughters. And even that, just two, the Habsburgs, a dynasty that stretched across continents and centuries, that married kingdoms like chess pieces and redrew Europe with parchment, is suddenly facing something it has never fully planned for a future with no boy. Joseph does not live to see the cost. He dies young, at 32, not from syphilis, ironically, but from smallpox, the disease that had ruined his marriage, that had stopped his legacy at the root. Lives longer than he does. The crown passes to his brother, Charles VI. He marries, weds, prays, but there is no son, only a daughter, Maria Theresa. And so the great empire, built on marriages, collapses under the weight of one, not the one Joseph arranged, but the ones he sought outside it. The War of Austrian Succession is not born from ambition. It is born from absence, from a throne left unstable by biology and silence, from a marriage broken not by betrayal, but by a disease too shameful to name. And history, that old archivist, never writes the true cause. It says dynastic tension. It says disputed succession. It says Charles left no male heir. But it never says Joseph gave his wife syphilis. She became infertile. There could be no son. Because history, like empire, prefers its stories clean. And yet, here we are, remembering not only the emperor, but the ghost he passed forward, the shadow that fell not on his own life, but on those who followed, who had to pretend the wound wasn't inherited. Wilhelmina Amalia lived long after him. She never remarried. She never spoke publicly of her condition. But those who saw her eyes said she walked like a woman carrying something she could never set down. Some burdens do not come with titles. Some crowns are invisible. Some poisons don't kill the man, they kill the line. Not every king dreams of ruling. Some, like Louis of Portugal, were dreamers before they were sovereigns. Men who thought more about rhythm than rule, more about language than lineage. He was the second son, never the first choice. And for many years, he lived exactly like a man, unburdened by destiny quietly. Inwardly, hunched over translations of Shakespeare into Portuguese, choosing sonnets over speeches, and silence over the sound of marching drums. He was not weak, only distant. Born in the year 1838, Louise was never expected to ascend the throne. His older brother, Pedro, carried the weight of expectation, while Louise carried paper and ink. But the royal body is fragile, and fate, it seems, does not care for birth order. Illness swept through the family like a slow tide. Pedro fell, others followed, and by the time the coughing stopped, Louise was alone. The poet became king. He did not resist, nor did he rejoice. He wore the crown as one might wear mourning carefully, because it was necessary, and so began a reign that shimmered, not with war or glory, but with the soft pulse of intellect. Louise was a scholar on the throne, a monarch with the soul of a translator. His court was modest, his tastes refined, and though he sat in gilded rooms, he often looked past them toward the sea, toward England, toward the words of others, as if always reaching for something just beyond his own voice. But not all distances are poetic. There were affairs. Yes, whispers of actresses, of encounters behind velvet doors, poot of women, without names or titles, who passed through the palace like verses lost to memory. He was not scandalous, but he was human, and in the quiet spaces between ceremony and solitude, between the obligations of a crown and the hunger of a man, something crossed the threshold. Syphilis. No one speaks of when it began. Perhaps Louis himself never knew. Perhaps he did, and chose not to look. But the disease was there, waiting like a comma in a sentence that had not yet ended. For years, it lay dormant, buried beneath the weight of policy and poetry. But syphilis is never patient forever. When it returned, it did not come with fury. It came with silence, with fatigue, with a gaze that lingered too long on nothing at all. And then, slowly, with confusion, his letters became erratic. His speech, once elegant, lost its cadence. He could not recall names, then dates, then decisions. There were days when his ministers spoke for him, pretending he had whispered what they invented. And there were nights when he did not speak at all. The court said he was tired. The physicians said nothing. But behind the red doors of Lisbon's palaces, a truth unfolded that no one could stop. The poet king was unraveling. His wife, Maria Pia of Savoy, tried to hold what remained. A queen from Italy, raised for ceremony, not for sorrow. She watched as the man she had once admired disappeared, piece by piece. Theirs had never been a great love, but there was a kind of partnership in their distance. Now, even that was gone. And so, in the final years of Louis's reign, Portugal had two monarchs, one who still walked the halls, and one who existed only in name. He died in the year 1889, 50 years old. A quiet death, with no drama, no revolution, no farewell that history bothered to record. The throne passed on. The kingdom endured, but those close enough to see him in the end to see the tremors, the vacant stare, the fading would remember. They would remember that not every king dies in battle. Some die by forgetting where they began, by losing the thread of their own voice. And they would remember that the great diseases of empire do not always arrive in warships. Sometimes they arrive in verses, in nights, in the spaces between lovers, in a moment too small to notice until everything breaks. Louis left behind no legacy of conquest, no child who changed the world, no monument so grand that it shadowed his death. He left behind only a silence, the kind that echoes longest when spoken by a man who once lived through words. There are some sons who are born to continue a legacy, and others who are born into it like a prison with velvet walls. Rudolph, Crown Prince of Austria, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, never truly held the scepter, yet he felt its weight from the moment he opened his eyes. He was the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph and Empress Elizabeth, known to most as Sisi, a mother too beautiful to be close, and a father too rigid to bend, even for the boy who bore his name. He grew up in rooms where silence was louder than song, and where duty sat beside him at every breakfast. reminding him, without words, that he was never truly alone, only watched. The Habsburg court, ornate and breathless, did not know how to raise a sensitive child. It knew how to discipline, how to instruct, how to flatten the spirit into something functional. But Rudolf, from a young age, had something untrainable in him: softness, curiosity, a mind that wandered, and a soul that bruised easily. He sought knowledge where others sought obedience. He read Darwin, admired liberal thinkers, and questioned things no heir was meant to question. His tutors tried to correct him. His father ignored him. His mother, trapped in her own exiles, was rarely near enough to intervene. And so, like many who are raised in marble cages, he found comfort where he could in books, in bottles, in beds not his own. Somewhere along the line, and the line was long, syphilis found him. It is unclear when. The records are careful, and the family more so, but there are hints, illnesses unexplained, sudden disappearances from court, whispers of a young mistress who left and never returned. And then, later, the confirmation not in diagnosis, but in consequence, he gave it to his wife. Stephanie of Belgium was not loved by him. Their marriage was cold, necessary, and ceremonial. A political chess move, not a bond. But what he passed on to her was not bitterness. It was biological. The infection rendered her infertile. There would be no second generation of Rudolf's line. The Habsburg succession, already thin, lost one more thread, and Rudolf, already disillusioned, already distant, began to dissolve from within. The disease made him paranoid, volatile, and uncertain. He suffered from hallucinations, from nightmares he could not speak aloud, from sudden shifts of mood that left his staff silent, and his father worried. But no one intervened. Not truly. Not in the way that might have stopped what was coming. He turned inward. Then he turned to her. Mary Vetsera was 17. Beautiful, romantic, possibly naive. She believed in him, or said she did, and that, perhaps, was enough. In her, Rudolf found not a future, but an exit, someone who would follow him, not forward, but away. In January of 1889, he took her to his hunting lodge at Merling. The details after that remain cloudy, intentionally so. The official version was rewritten more than once. There were letters forged, diaries hidden, but the truth, though blurred, was simple. He shot her, then himself, the son of an empire, dead on the floor beside a girl who thought she was following love. The Habsburg court shattered in silence. The emperor, usually immovable, wept privately. Elisabeth, who had already lost too much, walked farther away from the palace and deeper into grief. The dynasty, stunned. They tried to stitch the moment closed with ritual and lies, but the damage had already been done, not just to the family, but to the empire. Rudolf had been the bridge between two centuries. He was meant to modernize, to humanize, to soften the stone. Without him, the succession passed to Franz Ferdinand, who would be killed in Sarajevo, and the war that followed would unmake the world that had unmade Rudolf. But history prefers louder deaths. It writes of gunshots in Bosnia, not bedrooms in Merling, of assassins, not suicides, of declarations of war, not declarations of despair. And so the Crown Prince, who should have ruled an empire, became a footnote, a tragedy too quiet, too inconvenient, too personal. But beneath that silence lies something heavier than politics, because Rudolf did not just die, he gave up and that for a prince is the rarest thing of all. By the time Archduke Otto Franz of Austria entered adulthood, the empire his ancestors had built already creaked under its own weight. The rituals remained, the chandeliers still shimmered, the carriages still rolled through Vienna's wide boulevards, as if the world outside hadn't changed. But inside the palace, beneath the gold leaf and the measured Latin, there was something else: fatigue. Otto did not try to hide from it. He ran directly into it. They called him the Black Sheep, though not always with cruelty. Some said it with a grin, others with fear, a few with pity, but all agreed Otto was not like the rest. Where his brothers posed for portraits, Otto burst into rooms half-dressed. Where others quoted scripture, he quoted actress. And where dignity was expected, Otto delivered disruption. He was the man who arrived at formal dinners wearing nothing but a sword, the man who charged into women's quarters, shouting the names of saints, the man who wore his lineage like a costume, knowing it no longer meant what it once did. But ridicule is not freedom, and attention is not affection. Behind his chaos was something else, not rebellion, but rot. Because even as Otto performed for the court that never knew what to do with him, his body was beginning to betray him. He was in his 30s when the symptoms became undeniable. Not just the fatigue or the weight loss, but the ache in the joints, the lesions in private places, the slow unraveling of coherence. Like so many before him, he had caught it young, and like most of them, he tried not to name it. Syphilis. The empire that had survived so many wars would be undone by something far smaller, a bacterium, passed in secret, between bodies never mentioned in state records. At first, Otto ignored it. Then he tried to outrun it. He drank more, travelled farther, laughed louder. He built distractions as quickly as the disease built symptoms, but by the time the pain reached his face, there was nothing left to delay. His nose, the same nose that had once been painted in noble profile, collapsed. The cartilage dissolved. The infection, now in its late stages, moved without resistance. And so, a solution was offered. Not a cure. Those didn't exist. Not yet, but a mask. A prosthetic. Rubber. A false nose strapped to his face with wires, so that he could appear in public without frightening children or reminding dignitaries that royal blood, too, could rot. Imagine it. The great halls of Hofburg Palace. A dinner, lit by candlelight. And Otto, seated near the centre, trying to cut meat with trembling hands, unable to meet the eyes of anyone at the table. The mask never stayed still. It shifted when he spoke. It moved when he chewed. It betrayed him in every moment of silence. And yet, he continued, because what else could he do? He had no throne to inherit, no power to wield, only shame, and a court that no longer laughed at his madness, only looked away. He died at 41. There was no ceremony, no cause for celebration, only a quiet burial and a sigh of relief from those who had long feared what he represented. And yet, Otto was not the disease. He was the mirror, because in him, the Habsburgs saw not just scandal but consequence. The dynasty had long taught its children to marry for power, to repress emotion, to obey the church, to silence illness, to never speak of blood unless it was noble. And Otto, with his ruined face and his rubber mask, was the evidence that all of it had failed. They could no longer hide what they were becoming. And not long after Otto's death, they stopped trying. The empire collapsed a decade later. Officially, it was war, nationalism, the changing shape of Europe. But some say the end began much earlier. In bedrooms, in hallways, in silence, and in the face of a man whose nose had to be replaced with rubber just to pretend the dynasty was still intact. They wore crowns, some golden, some broken, some passed too early to heads not yet strong enough to carry them. Their portraits still hang in museums and palaces. Chin lifted, eyes steady, robes rich, but the colors have faded, and the silence behind the frame says more than any scepter ever could. We do not think of kings as bleeding. We do not imagine queens feverish and shivering in candlelit chambers. We are taught to see them as statues, as symbols, as something more than human. But in truth, they were exactly human. No more, no less. They touched, they longed, they were reckless. They hid, and what they tried to hide from the court, from the church, from each other was often the same thing: illness, but not illness like a cough or a chill. Something deeper, something that came not from battle, but from the body, passed quietly, unseen, unstoppable, and once inside, it waited. Lorenzo never saw his daughter grow up. Abbas II disappeared behind his own doors, before his voice was finished echoing. Rochester laughed until the fire burned through his laughter. Joseph, in loving carelessness, poisoned. The one woman history had entrusted to him. Louis tried to rewrite tragedy into verse, but the letters blurred before he could finish the sentence. Rudolph gave the world his exit in a locked lodge on a cold January morning. Otto wore a mask not out of vanity, but to hide what could no longer be hidden, and all of them powerful, privileged, remembered were brought to silence by the same thing. Syphilis. We call it the great imitator, because it does not storm the gates. It wears a smile. It waits in kisses, in wine-soaked sheets, in careless nights that feel like freedom and become something else entirely. It did not kill them all, but it changed them. And in changing them, it changed everything. Heirs were lost. Marriages were ruined. Empires cracked not always from revolution, but from within, because the body, even royal, is always the weakest point in a throne, and there is no armor against forgetting who we are when no one is watching. Not all of them were tragic. Some were simply unlucky. Some were foolish. Some were guilty. Some most were simply human. And in the end, that may be the true scandal of monarchy, that behind the lace and law, they were fragile, they were afraid, they were flesh. So, sleep now. Let the candles go out in the great halls. Let the chandeliers still themselves. The crowns are heavy. The beds are cold. The mirrors have stopped pretending. There is nothing left to uncover. Only the memory of power undone, not by war or betrayal, but by the quiet weight of something no royal decree could prevent. And tomorrow, when you wake, the palaces will still stand, but you will know that behind every velvet curtain, there was always a door no one dared open. Until now,